As Bob said, I have sort of two hats. I'm the chief privacy officer of the company, the first one actually. The mission of which is external outreach, dealing with privacy advocates and the privacy community generally. The other hat I wear is I run the data systems team that does all the big data crunching of people data that we do at the company. So it was an odd career trajectory to get me here. I'm actually really excited to be here. I did my graduate work here in, I'm going to date myself, but working at Intelius, everyone knows everything about you that's publicly known. So I graduated here about '96. So it's great to be back. I brought my Seattle weather. Sorry about that. But let me tell you a little bit about Intelius. For those that don't know, we're a direct-to-consumer provider of information about people and businesses, but really about people. And we are a pretty big site. We power people search on the internet for Yahoo, for AT&T. We own US Search and Zaba Search. If you're looking for someone online, chances are that road will lead to us. We're a ComScore 100 site. And we do a lot with people data. Just because this audience is about big data, I thought I'd talk about the big data problem. We see billions of records of people, about people. I like to say there's a data supply chain, and we sort of sit at the end of it. So we're the consumer side. So we are voracious acquirers of data, but we sell data, provide data, sort of one report at a time. You can't come to Intelius and say, give me 100 million email addresses. We don't sell lists. Okay, we are consumer facing. So we see billions of records, and we see about many records for every individual. For example, there's about 37 people named Jim Adler in this country. We probably have around 200 records for that Jim Adler, and our job is to figure out which of those 200 records go with those 37 people. And so it's a clustering problem really, and each node is a record, and these things cluster up. So there's this ambulance chasing lawyer down in Houston, Texas. That's this Jim Adler, and he spends a lot of effort creating records on the internet and elsewhere, and we gather those records up, and that's where that cluster is. And this is humble me down in here in Redmond. That's my record cluster, and all the other 35 Jim Adlers are represented in that cluster. If you go look at a cluster in some detail, this is Dennis Rodman's cluster, and the reason he's interesting is because he has a pretty broad footprint. He has a Twitter profile, and he has a Facebook profile, and he also has a criminal record, and he's been the subject of civil suits. And so if you look at where we get this data, we get it from a lot of places, we cluster it up, and that becomes the online public profile for someone like Dennis Rodman, and we all have them. We all have a public footprint, okay? So that's what Intelius does. A little bit about me. So as you know, I'm not an attorney. Many chief privacy officers are attorneys, so my colleagues out there are attorneys. I'm an engineer, much more of the geek nerd variety, although I'm told high functioning, which is why I'm in this job. And I think I have one foot in the policy camp and one foot in the technology camp, and that gives me a unique perspective on some of these issues, and I'm going to talk specifically about that, because I think the world is grappling with privacy and what are private spaces, what are public spaces, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. So I'll talk a little bit about my trajectory through my career, and then sort of where we are in the world of online social media and privacy. So as you know, right, I spent my early career in San Diego, up on Kearny Mesa, where General Dynamics Space Systems division used to be, and it was bought by Lockheed Martin about 10, 12 years ago, I think. And so I showed up for work, actually, on January 26th, 1986. And the reason I was hired here was to put the Centaur upper stage in the space shuttle, right? So the space shuttle, before that time, had an inertial upper stage, a solid rocket motor. And General Dynamics had this liquid rocket that they wanted to put, or upper stage they wanted to put in the shuttle. So I was hired to do that. Came right out of school, and the day after I show up, the Challenger blew up. The day after. And so everything stopped, of course. It was a government project. And we started to study what happened, or we didn't specifically look at it, but we were watching the Rogers Commission study this. And I think this is informative because when we're young, we all imprint easily, right? Native language syndrome, chicks imprinting on the first thing they see as their mother. I was a young engineer, and right out of school, my first job was looking at the Rogers Commission and seeing what happened. And there was a lot of political wrangling and bureaucratic wrangling, and one individual emerged out of this, and many of you know who he is, Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, who was on the Rogers Commission. And he didn't want to be on this commission, and his wife actually convinced him to be on it, because she said, there'll be 11 guys in a knot running around to all these briefings, and you'll be the only mosquito trying to figure out what really happened. And Rogers, the head of the commission, actually said at one point, Feynman's becoming a real pain and difficult to deal with. But it turns out that he actually did figure out what was going on. He realized that in that very cold Florida morning, the O-rings that separated the booster stages lost their elasticity in the cold weather. And in a famous hearing of the Rogers Commission, he had an O-ring while everyone was speaking in a cup of ice water. And when it came his time to speak, he said, well, I'll tell you what happened. It was a cold morning. The O-rings lost their elasticity. And just like this O-ring in this glass of ice water that's at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, he pulled the O-ring out and he snapped it like a toothpick. And I thought that was just ingenious. Not just that he figured it out, but that he was able to take a simple physical phenomenon and apply it to this sprawling bureaucracy that had billions of dollars invested, and was able, with good science and good data, cut through it all. And for someone who was ready to apply all that they learned in college to an industry, I just thought there was something profound going on here. And throughout my career, I started to look at other eclectic innovators, I began to think of them as, like Feynman, like Jeff Jonas, who does a lot of work with big data, Mark Zuckerberg around social nets, and of course, it's funny, I've been giving this talk for a long time, probably a lot of this year, and I always had Steve Jobs at the center of it, and with that caption, and unfortunately, when he died, it was ironic, but it's very true. I mean, he was one of the eclectic innovators that really stands out. Noria Oga actually is an interesting story. He was the president of Sony in the 70s, and he mandated that a CD hold 74 minutes of music. And the reason he mandated that was he was an opera student, and he wanted to hear Beethoven's Ninth in one sitting. So he mandated that his engineers make sure a CD can hold 74 minutes of music. And I think that's really, again, taking a piece of culture and applying it to a piece of technology that fundamentally changes our lives. And that's what all of us are engaged in as engineers and technologists. Steve Jobs often said that the problem with Microsoft is they have no taste. And he said, and not taste in a small way, taste in a big way, right? They don't apply culture to technology. They just apply technology to technology, and I think that you lose a huge opportunity when you do that. And I think Steve Jobs, having been beleaguered by Microsoft dominance for so many years, ultimately turned out to be proven correct. Glad he lived long enough to see it. But I think there's huge, profound lessons here, and I think there is for some of the talk today. So I'm going to talk about sort of the evolution of privacy. This is my Chief Privacy Officer evolution, and one of my son's classmates at SCU made this graphic for me. I love working with college kids. They literally work for food, and this was done for food. But I think it really talks to the idea of where privacy has gone from innocence to this frontier where we are now to this solution around we're going to just regulate our way out of it to really where I think ultimately we're going is innovation. That innovation, like most advances, are going to get us out of this sort of seeming conundrum around privacy. So let's sort of dive into this. We're going to kind of skip to the frontier, sort of just to calibrate us for where we are with technology. Some of this, I think you'll know. You know, if you look at the surface web, there's almost 200 terabytes of data out there on the surface web, and this is just stored data, not duplicated or moved around, which is about 40 million King James Bibles, if you just wanted to put it in context. I like passionate metaphors for privacy because it gets people pretty, privacy does pretty excited. If you look at the deep web, there's about 91,000 terabytes, which is about 20 billion King James edition Bibles, a lot more data. If you look at it a different way, there's been about 20 exabytes both stored and moved and replicated from the dawn of civilization of 2002. And in April of this year, we moved 4 times that much. And April was a short month. A lot of data. And for a lot of reasons. These are some of the reasons that people do searches on our site. Some of them regulated, most of them not. Everything from lawyers needing quick access to court records, to professionals looking for colleagues at conferences, to airlines looking for people that have lost luggage. This one I really love. There's a data analyst that's working for us now, and a couple years ago, her dog needed a bone marrow transplant, so she needed to find the owner of her dog's sibling. So she actually came to Intelius to find the owner of her dog's sibling, which is something I could never have guessed. So a lot of interesting uses, a lot of benefits. Right? This is a Pew study, kind of dated now, but a lot of people find ease and convenience in these technologies, a lot of benefits. People love to share, but real concerns too, right? 90% very concerned if their data is sold, used for marketing, very concerned if their data is used to serve them ads. So the idea here, or the conclusion that some are coming to, can the internet and privacy coexist? And I would argue that it really can. I am somewhat of a pragmatic optimist, and I do think innovation is going to help us sort of merge this Venn diagram. But I think I want to step back because I think we often get biased by our current experience. If you look back 150 years, all right, 19th century, people lived in small towns. They knew everyone. It's a famous Norman Rockwell painting that kind of speaks to this idea that if you tell something to someone, it gets around town pretty quickly. I spent a couple years in Greensboro, Alabama growing up. I think the population now is 2,500. I think then it was about 1,500. And if you cut school, the whole town knows by dinner. All right, everybody talks. And so there was low privacy expectation. And if you look at some of the legal standard around privacy, the reasonable expectation of privacy is a legal standard. The problem with that standard is the word reasonable and the word expectation moves around a lot. So that's why privacy is a tough thing. But with low population density, there was really low anonymity and a relatively low privacy expectation. Now you fast forward, through the last 150 years, with the growth of densely populated cities, the fact that anonymity grew with that and privacy expectation grew with that, we are now faced in the last decade with what I've sort of called privacy vertigo, which is this social media is really changing the way the last several, 5, 6 generations have thought about privacy. So density is dropping, anonymity is dropping, we're knowing more people, our privacy expectation is having downward pressure, and we don't like it. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we need to not like it and need to understand what is appropriate and what's fair. And one of the symptoms of this, I don't know how many use Google+. but there's been this NIMS wars. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the NIMS wars on Google+. Google+ requires you to use a real name, right? And they've been relatively assertive with this policy. If you don't use a real name, they kick you off Google+. And so there's been this real controversy around this. And so I did a study of the couple 100 million people that are in our data and sort of looked and said, how many people in real life use more than one name? And it turns out about 17% actually do use more than one name in real life. And so I did a blog post on this, and I thought it would sort of nod to the idea that although it's a minority, it's a pretty big minority. 17% of people is a lot of people. Sure, most of them, I imagine, are women who maintain a name, both probably their maiden name professionally and their married name as well. But people use more than one name. So to have a draconian policy that says you must use your real name seemed like a little bit of learning the Facebook real names lesson too much, sort of over-learning that lesson. And I think they are backing off of it now. So I think these kinds of controversies are really important. I think companies innovate, and they get pushed back, and they figure out where truth might be. I think that's a good thing. Because I think if they don't, you end up with this sort of regulation, which I think often creates as many problems as it solves. But let's talk about regulation a little bit and understand the landscape. How do you think about public and private? I mean, it's sort of this idea that everyone almost thinks they understand it intuitively. I would argue we really don't. Jeff Jarvis, who has a book and writes about this a lot, says, hey, we're social animals and there are benefits to publicness, to being out there in public. And then in the 19th century, Brandeis and Warren wrote that said, hey, privacy is the right to be let alone. And I think that's important too. Jarvis in his book points to a hypothesis that Neanderthals were actually smarter than Homo sapiens. They had larger brain cases, but they were not social. And so they didn't share the mistakes they made, right? Only a fool learns from their own mistakes, right? The wise learn from others. Maybe Neanderthals didn't learn from each other's mistakes enough. And Homo sapiens were able to collectively crowdsource their wisdom, and they were able to compete effectively with a species that was maybe smarter. Interesting hypothesis. I don't know if it'll be proven out. But I think we need to examine what's public and what's private. And I just want to look at a few use cases here. Public speaking, clearly public, right? I'm speaking here today. I'm on video. I expect this will be on the web. This will be public. I have no expectation of privacy here. Voting is kind of a different animal. It's privately public. People know I did vote. They don't know how I voted. Right? An important distinction, right? Some things, publicly private, right? Go to a concert, there are private spaces, and there need to be private spaces. Your home is clearly private. Constitutionally, it's private because the Constitution actually protects us from our government with privacy constitutional mandates. But there's really no constitutional protections between citizens. People think they have a right to privacy from each other. You really don't. You have tort protections, but you don't have constitutional protections. And so I did this post around the Electronic Communication Privacy Act. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's essentially the federal wiretap law. And I did this I like these sort of notional graphs that said, if you look at privacy rights versus power disparity, Bruce Schneier, who's a famous cryptographer, talks about privacy with respect to power disparity between the actors, right? So there's relatively low privacy right between citizen and citizen. Between citizen and corporation, there's a little bit more privacy right because the power disparity is greater. And if you look at some of the laws we have in the books, corporations have certain responsibilities when they're executing practices against us citizens, for example, around employment or housing. And then between government and citizen, it's huge. Big power disparity, big privacy rights, and of course things fall off between your God and you. And And I think that's really important to understand, that there isn't this global, at least in the United States. The EU is a little different. Europe's a little different. Every country is a little different. But in the US, at least, that's the regime. So it would be nice to have a familiar framework for online privacy. And you start to see some of that already. Cloud banking is clearly private, right? In the United States, we are very private around our finances. And the banks, of course, would lose a lot of customers if they were not careful about that. Tweeting, mostly public. Right? I need to stop telling people about Twitter so I can continue to talk about them. Cloud dating is publicly confidential. It starts confidential, but it starts to move public probably pretty quickly. The Federal Trade Commission earlier this year put out some guidelines around how to think about privacy. It used to be very simple. Personally identifiable information is private, and that's kind of where it was left. But they introduced this, and not just the Federal Trade Commission, but the privacy community at large, these fair information practice principles, which talk about not overusing the data, using for what it was intended. I think privacy by design is this idea that you need to embed privacy into the design of your products. And I think that really informs everybody in this room actually quite profoundly. Because it used to be that products were designed and then they got approved, and that's not really the case anymore. And we're going to talk about that a little later. But the Federal Trade Commission actually is involved in privacy, and they have something to say, and will continue to have a say in it. Because we have something to say about, as technologists, something to say about privacy, I thought I'd take a lesson from machine learning. I hang out with a lot of data scientists and data engineers all the time, so we talk about this a lot. Everybody, confusion matrix? Yes? No? I'll briefly explain it. So the idea when you train a computer to learn something, you try to measure its performance relative to what it predicts compared to what the actual truth is. And in these confusion matrices, the diagonals are clarity, and the anti-diagonals represent confusion. Okay? So in the world of Intelius, where we do a lot of people matching of records, for example, a true match would be these two records belong to the same person and the computer predicts it's the same person, right? Or these two records belong to different people, and when I say different people, you use the Jim Adler example, right? I have two records for Jim Adler. The true positive said they both belong to me, and the true negative would be they actually belong to two different Jim Adlers, okay? The anti-diagonals is when the computer gets it wrong, right? When when the example is two records belong to me, but the computer says they don't belong to me, right? As opposed to they belong to different people, and the computer says they belong to the same person, or vice versa. So I applied this to regulations, right? Because I always get aggravated with policymakers who kind of mix things up, and it's easy to mix things up. It really is. And so I started to look at regulations and violations, right? The idea is that regulation should deal with the violations that the regulations are intended for. And when you look at data, you tend to look at it in two axes, either the access to the data itself versus the use of the data, okay? So again, the diagonals are clarity, right? So you look, ideally, you would like data use regulations to address data use violations. And the Fair Credit Reporting Act is pretty much the only widespread law that does that, right? The Fair Credit Reporting Act, for those that don't know, it says that if I find out any information about you, and it's for a certain kinds of purpose, like employment or housing, I have to ask your permission first to do a check on you. And then if I find out any adverse information, I have to tell you about it, right? Because you could be a victim of mistaken identity. The data could be wrong. And so it's really important that you are part of that loop, because if it's your livelihood or it's the place you live, that really impacts your life. And so this act came out in 1970, I mean, I think it's probably the most inspired piece of legislation that has come out in the last 50 years, easy. Data access is a lot easier. So if you look at, like, Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, right, the government cannot access your house, cannot access your body, right? Roe v. Wade is a Fourth Amendment and 14th Amendment kind of protection. Gramm-Leach-Bliley says you can't access financial data. Child Online Privacy Protection Act, child information. We talked about Electronic Communication Privacy Act. DPPA is drivers' driving information. HIPAA is health. There are 46 states have state breach disclosure laws, which says that if you do business on my site and I lose your customer data, I got to tell the press about it, right? And there's a good value. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So the anti-diagonals are interesting, and this is the one I'm most worried about, that we are going to regulate data use violations with data access regulations. So essentially, and this impacts everyone who deals with data, basically says, we know there's some violations here, let's turn off the data. And the problem I have with that is that there's this great piece called Opt-in Dystopias that I highly recommend. And it talks about opt-in versus opt-out. You know, where opt-out sort of kind of discounts the costs, right? Because you've already kind of you're in the system, you've got all the benefits, but you don't know what the costs are yet. Where opt-in sort of discounts the benefits. Before you even get in, you're sort of saying, I don't want to get in because I'm worried about the costs. But you don't know what the benefits are because you're not in yet. So I think there's a lot of unintended consequences as a shutting everything off. The easy analogy here is we know there's baby in bathwater. We just don't know what percentage is baby and what percentage is bathwater. Right? Is it 90% baby, 10% bathwater? Maybe you want to be a little judicious. If it's the other way around, you got some foul water. So I think we have to be nuanced and thoughtful about this. And that's kind of where innovation comes in, because I think we have to figure out to be smart and nuanced about some of this. And I think within a corporate setting, and I often give this talk to my colleagues in industry, if you look at the basic product development life cycle, and this is true whether it's automobiles or data, right? You start with raw materials, you do some product development, you do some quality assurance and compliance testing, and you release it and then you market it, okay, roughly. The problem is compliance happens way down here. And if there's a problem there, it's a lot of money to go back and a lot of pressure not to go back. And so this whole idea of privacy by design really is what it's trying to do is remove compliance from that spot and actually embed it in all aspects of the product life cycle. Because I think that's the only way you can get in there early and do some good work. And I'll talk about some examples of where that could actually be important. And I think that what that really means is no matter what field you're in, if you're a technologist, you're going to have to deal with privacy concerns and general cultural concerns throughout your work. It's a reality. And I think it's a good reality, actually. Just to drive this home a little bit, Hillary Mason is the chief data scientist at Bitly. Everybody knows who Bitly, the URL shortener. She has this great adage, math plus code is awesome, right? When I give this pitch to privacy activists, they say, wait a minute, is that really always true? Because awesome sometimes means awesomely destructive. There's a book by Scott Patterson that mathematicians nearly brought the world economic system to its knees. So it's not always that math plus code is awesome. I would propose a corollary to Mason's maxim and just put a coefficient out front that said your values times the quantity math plus code is awesome. And of course, what's going on in your head is, well, that's easy to say. What values? There's a lot of values. And the challenge is that some of these values are in conflict, and they're contextual. They're situational. Prudence and connection, disclosure and discretion are often in conflict. And that's okay. We got to figure out, based on the context, which value really matters. So I started to think about this, and I tried to say, okay, for privacy, for what the privacy community is really concerned about, which one of these values kind of maps to the situation that is providing a lot of heat, political heat. And so I started to look at food. Figure food is something that we all do socially. It seemed kind of looking at this a little bit and seeing if there's any lessons to be learned. Yeah, we eat, we share. Data, food, seems like there might be something there. Reminds me of the little boy who's in the room full of manure, really happy as a lark. His mom comes in and says, "Why are you so happy? In this room full of manure, there must be a pony in here somewhere." A pescatarian digression. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I talk about this. So I don't eat chicken, I don't eat beef, but I do eat fish, and this is about 25 years ago, I made this decision. And my wife also made a similar decision, but it was before we had met, and so we analyzed what brought us to this same decision. We came through different paths, and my argument was, I read this study that said a carnivore's intestinal tract is 2 to 3 times their height, their body length. And an herbivore, it's about 6 to 12 times. Their intestinal tract is 6 to 12 times the length of their body. And that makes sense for a carnivore because the carcass is rotting and they want to get as much nutrients out and then expel the rest. Maybe this wasn't a good talk to schedule before lunch. And it turns out that the human intestinal tract is about 6 times our body length. So I said, I don't know if I want to spend the next, hopefully, 60 to 80 years absorbing a lot of toxins, right? So I was a young kid in college, again, impressionable, and I said, I don't think I'm going to do that. So I stopped eating red meat, chicken, pork, whatever. But I still eat still eat fish. So my wife's different point of departure. She didn't like factory farming. She thought she did it for humanitarian reasons. And we have been fighting about this for about the last 22 years. Because my argument is these guys aren't as cute as these guys. They're not. These guys are smarter than these guys. Well, there doesn't seem to be a good debate, an argument to be had around that. So I think you have to. Everyone has an opinion, and I think whether it's food or whether it's privacy, everybody has an opinion. But what does the data say? And you can argue with my data, and even on this decision, you could say, well, Jim, the data is faulty, or it's really not true, or we have different enzymes or whatever to take care of those and to mitigate some of the concerns. Sure enough, at least we're debating the data. We're not debating issues that are not around data. So I started to look at food, and back to our 80 exabytes of data a month. Turns out we consume a lot of food. April, 35 gigacalories. A lot of food. So I looked at then another one of these graphs around food and privacy policy over time, since about 1880. And the blue line is food, and the red line is privacy. And being an old double E, I sort of said, wow, that looks like how current leads the voltage in a capacitor or something like that. And I said, that's interesting. So why did food lead privacy? And so I started to look at the food curve, and I said, okay, what happened here? Well, if you look at the snake oil days of the 19th century, that culminated in the Pure Food Act of 1906. And then things settled down quite a bit until after World War II. In World War II, there was this growth in refrigeration and a lot of innovation around food processing. And there were these peanut butter hearings that almost went on for a decade to decide what percentage of peanuts had to be in a jar of peanut butter for it to be called peanut butter. And it was like insane. 92%, 87%, 96%, nope, 80, we can get by with 85%. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, they said, let's just put it on the label, the percentage of peanuts. Let the consumer decide. And then you had this big era of labeling reform, which said, hey, let's just be as transparent as we can because we really don't know the answer, and let everyone make their own decision, which I thought was quite inspired. So until now, when you have the genetically modified foods, this is rising again. And what I didn't do really, which I should have done early, what is the y-axis here? It's one of my notional y-axes, which is the political heat to scientific light ratio. What I found is that when there's not a lot of scientific light, that ratio blows up. Or when there's a lot of political heat, even if there's some science, it blows up. I think climate change that's blowing up. Even though there's a lot of scientific light, there's a boatload of political heat, and that ratio is blowing up. But if you don't have any science at all, a little bit of political heat can blow up that ratio. And when that ratio blows up, you get legislation, you get regulation, you get a lot of court actions, you get a lot of what I call a dissipation of negative energy, right? There's this conservation of negative energy. It goes somewhere. So if you look at privacy, kind of similar, the robber barons of the 19th century and their activity culminated in the FTC being established in 1914, which sort of quelled the whole antitrust concerns. And then things quieted down until around civil rights, and where the Federal Trade Commission was active around privacy and culminated in the Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970. And things quieted down until now. And I think in the last year, I was just on a panel yesterday for the Professional Liability Underwriter Society. These are people that underwrite corporate insurance. So these are people that have to clean up the messes that corporations make. There's been like 10 class action lawsuits filed in the last 8 months around privacy. Like, it's been the biggest year, a boom crop for class actions around privacy. So, and I think that's because we don't know. There's not enough scientific light here. And so why isn't there? And so you sort of look at, back to the food analogy, why is genetically modified foods catching so much heat? I would argue that there's not a lot of transparency around the science. Is the same genetics around GMO the same genetics we learned about Mendel in high school? I don't know. There's not enough transparency to sort of make an adequate conclusion or draw an adequate conclusion from that. So the public's sort of left guessing. And then if there's guessing, then there's a lot of politicizing, and then things don't move. So transparency is important, and you see that even now, right? If there's an E. coli outbreak, it's on the news. Why? Don't eat that food. Don't go eat at those restaurants until they figure it out what happened. I think when you look at state breach disclosure laws around losing data, there needs to be transparency, and the thought and the value underneath that is that people need to know so they can either cancel their credit cards, get identity theft insurance, take appropriate actions. So that, I think transparency is a really important value. And I think when you don't have it, you have a lot of anxiety. This is a privacy policy on the left and a Korean food label on the right. And for me, I don't speak Korean. So this food label, and I read a lot of privacy policies, sheds about as much light as that privacy policy does. And so the fact that you have a policy, but if it's opaque, it really doesn't inform. It really isn't transparent. And I think that's really what's sort of bubbling up here, is that you can't just sort of paper this over with a privacy policy and be done with it. If you look, there's been 30 years of labeling reform to get food to be better labeled, to be more transparent, and to be more informative. And I think that with respect to personal data, could there be something like that, right, where you know what's out there about you? And I think as we move more and more of our data online, There needs to be an understanding of awareness of the data that's out there about you, some level of control. And so there's a lot of innovation going on in this area. I'm going to shamelessly plug one of my company's products that we're actually launching next week. It's called TrueRep. And this product sort of came out of a lot of scrutiny, quite frankly, from the privacy community. We had people come and say, I know people can get my background report from Intelius. Why can't I get my own? Why can't I look at my own information? And so this product sort of came out of that idea. And so for free, you can get a thumbnail of your background report. There's some privacy controls that are in there. And I think what's really interesting, sort of a subtext of one of the features, when I started Intelius 3 years ago, I did a listening tour of all the privacy not all of them, the ones that I really thought were tough critics of the company. I wanted to hear what we were doing right, if anything, what we were doing wrong, and see how we might be able to do better. I went to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, who were one of the critics of Intelius. That said, hey, this fuels domestic violence because offenders can find information about women, and it's mostly women. And so Cindy Southworth runs their she's a VP of technology, runs their technology efforts. And I said, Cindy, what can we do? And she said, it's very simple, Jim. Get my women out of your data. And Cindy's very blunt. And I said, OK, give me the list. And so we started to do that. And it turns out victims of domestic violence don't like to be on any lists. Okay, even if it's a benign benefit, they don't want to be on a list. So I said, okay, we'll give you pins that they can then use, pin codes they could type in and do it themselves. And that was more interesting. They kind of thought about that. We worked together for a few more months. Then they had this, what I thought was a pretty inspired idea. One of the concerns they had, and some of the women had, were the fact that if they disappeared completely off the site, off our site, the offender would know that the victim was taking drastic action. And there could be ramifications back to the victim from the offender. And it's not something you just think. You think, yeah, let's get them out. And so they suggested, can you just suppress the latest contact information? Leave the rest of the address history. But the current contact information is what's most safety sensitive. I thought that was brilliant. We didn't think of that. And what I liked even more about it was that this wasn't a solution just for an at-risk community, because I hate that. As an engineer, you don't want these sort of one-off features for certain groups of customers, because those features just practically don't get the love and the maintenance that the full product line does. So we said, we're just going to give this feature to all our customers. And that feature is now in TrueRep. So you can actually go in for free and knock out your latest contact information, address, and phone. So it was sort of if you look at what is privacy by design, what does that mean? It's a nice, catchy phrase. But it was listening to your toughest critics and your customers and smart people that you have access to, and then embed them in the product design process, and good things happen. Another example. We'll have a time for questions, I hope. I'm wrapping up. If you go on Google and you type in a name, you'll see an ad on the right. Depends on the name, but you'll likely see an ad for that name. We purchase keywords on Google and Bing so that people that are looking for people can come to our site. It's probably the biggest AdWord campaign in Google history, by far. Because we're buying, think of how many names are in the United States, a lot. And so we had this for a while. Google got to a point where they didn't really like it for privacy reasons. They shut it off. We started to work with them and understand why. Went to the privacy community and said, hey, what do you think about this? The privacy community really didn't have a problem with it, because they said, look, anybody's going to type the name into Google, they're going to see Intelius anyway in the organic search results. They're going to click Intelius, and they're going to type the name again into your site. Seems like it's skipping a step. So they didn't have a problem with it. We suggested, obviously the concern is that if it's your name, you may want to opt out or have some privacy controls. So we suggested, instead of someone having to go to our privacy policy and find how they opt out, we'll just put it right above the search form. Is this you? Click here for privacy options. And then it walks you right into our opt-out. Google loved it. Campaign's back on. Privacy community is happy. Again, a rather nuanced solution, not as nuanced as the safety-sensitive contact information, but I think, again, you're listening to your community, you're embedding it in your product and your marketing campaigns, and it's a good thing. So what that really points to is that, privacy isn't dead. I mean, a lot of high-tech executives like to say privacy's dead, get over it. It's not dead. It's very, very, very much alive. I did this blog post around Father's Day around sort of a dad-to-dad, social netiquette for dads, dealing with your kids on the social nets. And just, your kids are hiding, well, you guys are kids. My kids are hiding from me online. They're hiding right in plain sight, right? They speak in code, and there is a culture developing within social networks between children and their parents and adults generally, and that's a good thing, because kids are very interested. We're all interested in privacy. Privacy is very contextual. You want to have some control in certain situations. Certain situations you really don't care, and that's okay. And so the problem is we don't know, as a technologist, with our blinders on, trying to just figure out if this thing will even work at all, what are the often orthogonal cultural, societal implications of that technology? And we need to think about those. And the only ways the best way I've found so far to think about those is talk to the people that don't like it. Innovation is this team sport, right? You're not the only one on the team. There's others that don't like what you're doing, that are going to be critical, that are going to have great ideas. Some are going to change the product, which is really good. It empowers everybody to embed these values into this technology. I think within organizations, you have to drive this influence within the organization. For a lot of industry folks, the Archimedes principle, show me where to stand, I'll move the earth. That's often not in the corner office in the executive suites. It's actually in the product teams with the engineers and the product people trying to figure out how this product can work within the confines of a social situation. I would also argue, you got to be the happy warrior here. A lot of people get very agitated about some of these things. It doesn't really help to just get pissed off and pipe off at people. There's this, I'm sure you've seen it, sort of the triangle of arguments, right? Where if you can deal with the central theme of the argument and argue that, and skip the ad hominem attacks and criticize someone's standing, long as there's transparency around conflicts. My conflicts are on my sleeve. I work for this company. This company is about shareholder value, but it also, if it's going to be successful, has to deliver some societal and customer value. And I think we need to have that discussion. It is our job to push as an industry and company. It's the job of others to push back. And we need to find out where that happy medium is. And I think the last one is really important for data scientists and people who are dealing with data, is find clarity within the confusion. There's a lot of confusion out there. I've given some examples of looking at food history, understanding where confusion might arise or where it might arise. Because I think with some data and with some perspective, historical or technological or statistical, you can cut through a lot of this. I mean, just like at the top of the talk with Feynman, simple physical concept applied to a lot of confusion actually cut through a lot of the agony during that period, a lot of it emotional. So I think we're not at the end of this, we're at the beginning of this. You all are starting your careers. I never thought I would be in this situation, and just to wrap it up, can take maybe a couple questions if we have time. This is a very empowering industry and place to be, and the fact that you can be technical and have a foot in policy is an incredible place to be. Yes, sir.
So in your opted out discussion, you mentioned the idea of benefits. So I can see the benefits that Intelius offers to someone else using my information. What benefits do I get from you having my information? In other words, why should I not simply, why is it not in my best interest for no information about me to be known to Intelius?
Because I think if you take just Intelius out of it, I think what your argument is, why should there be no public information about me? Your framing is it's my information, right? Right? I would push back a little bit on the ownership framing. The fact that you're in public and people are connecting with you is based on the public information they know about you, right? So I think that the framing often is sort of either I own my information or I'm part of this public, right? And I think the interesting bit is not that, because you don't own all your information. I was leaving a Mariners game during the season. I'm walking up the ramp, and this girl's just taking pictures of everybody coming up the ramp. Do I own that picture? It's of me. No, I don't own that picture. I'm in a public space. I am now part of the public. And the analogy is simply to an older time, which is, hey, did you see Jim at the game? So I think your argument is, really, is there any data that's public that shouldn't be public, right?
No, my question is, why shouldn't I want to know for you to have
any data?
Right. So I can understand your argument that that's not my data. You have a right to have my data. But that's a different argument from it is to my benefit for you to have this data.
Because I think that there's benefit for you having data that's public. Some of it you put out there yourself. A lot of it you put out there yourself, right? You put data out there publicly, and you do that because benefits accrue to you. People learn about you. They learn that you're a smart guy, that you're trustworthy, that you're responsible, and they do that based on the public information that's out there, and those benefits accrue back to you. People also they learn from your mistakes, and that actually could accrue back to you, right? I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. A lot of them are up there publicly. I think that people know that I've been around the block a few times. They may listen to my perspective. That accrues to me, some professional stature. So I think there are benefits.
Okay, I'll let it.
Okay.
Just continue on his thing. If somebody took a picture of you and posted it all over the internet, is that legal still?
Yeah, it is legal.
So you can have that.
Yeah. Now, if it's, there are certain torts, damages that if they violated your privacy, if they put a camera in a place that was not public, clearly that would be a violation.
I was just going on your website. It was like you list date of birth and things like that about anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of that is not information that people want to know. It makes it more easy for like credit card fraud and other things like that.
And I think that there's certainly information that is public, or all that information is public. Your question really is, what's the reasonable level, the expectation of privacy level, right? I think you're saying, hey, the reasonable expectation of privacy is higher, right? You have a higher level of expectation of privacy for that piece of data. Like you're like, why do they have my age there, right?
Yeah, and that also, can I go on there and be like, I don't want to be in your listing service?
Yeah. We have an opt-out, right? The point is that that data, but opt-out aside, and we're not under any legal obligation to provide that opt-out because it's all public data. So what we provide that as a courtesy, I think, because there are concerns out there, and reasonable expectation levels of privacy vary around a lot between people and cultures. So you have 2 points there, really. That reasonable expectation of privacy argument and the harm. You point to harm. People could use that information to harm me, right? Like identity theft, I think you mentioned. Right.
I don't think it's of anybody's interest to have some of these.
Right, but it is publicly available. So I think that we have to. It is. I mean, the challenge. I know it's a hard truth, and I think there's value. That's why I think it.
So how is it publicly available? Like you have to drive down to this this
Mm-hmm.
clerk and then grab that information out, or is it publicly available where I can search it and find it somewhere else online? That like where is the source of this information that you're?
It's generally public records, vital records, and
Somebody actually had to like drive down to the city to grab these records.
yeah. So you make the.
It's not like public rule.
They're publicly accessible. I mean, I think the thing that shifts is the amount of effort required to
Yeah,
get at it.
exactly.
So privacy through obscurity is a level of privacy expectation that we expect, right? So traditionally we've said, well, if you got to go down to the court and get it, that means that it's not widely available. And so there is some innovation and some disruption going on, and you're completely right. I mean, there is disruption going on here. And that's why we're having this public discussion, which is why I'm here today, and I've been talking about this a lot, is I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that there is a discussion that's happening right now. The reality is this information is out there. It's legal. There's some benefits that accrue to people. There's some consequences that accrue to people. And our job is not necessarily just to ignore it and let someone else. The reason I took this job is I want to figure out what the right answer is. Because someone's going to figure it. Someone's going to take this information and run with it. Yes, sir.
So I have two comments. I'm one of those people who deletes all the cookies every 24 hours from my browser, just
Right.
in case. And my concern is that I don't control the use of information that I put out and make available. Sometimes I want to make some information available, but I don't want it to be used to serve me ads. I don't want it to be aggregated and searchable, for example. I do not have the technical ability, as of this minute, to enforce that. So now what you seem to be saying, actually I have two comments. And the first comment is that you seem to be saying is, I don't own this information once you put it outside. And I have no right to restrict its use in any way, shape, or form. I would not agree with that. I think who owns the information depends on the laws and culture and can change over time, and has been. There's certain information that people would find out and own immediately once they find that out. And there's certain other information that they don't own even after they found it. So I think there's room for regulation in this area. So that's one comment, and
Okay.
I'll just make the second comment.
Sure.
And then you can respond. The second comment is you have this opt-out system that allows people to control what information is available about them. But just because you've decided to do the responsible thing, somebody else might not. And so I was wondering if you agree with the comment that maybe this is not the right end from which to attack the problem. Right, it has to be attacked from the source, and not from the aggregators, and there need to be regulations that restrict information dissemination, and not just voluntary efforts on behalf of people who collect it.
Okay, so let me talk about to your two comments. First is, I think when you say that you are trying to have a private experience, right? When you're deleting your cookies, you are trying to have a private experience, and so it really comes down to giving you the ability to have a private experience, and I'm a fan of that. I would like to have bright lines between what's a private experience and what's a public experience, what's privately available and what's publicly available. And you're right that that's very blurry right now, and it creates a huge amount of controversy around people that want to have private experiences, especially around communication. And you would argue, I'm sure you would argue, that my browsing habits are a private experience, and so I am a big fan of private experiences. For example, I'm not a fan of smart grid. For those that don't know, it's allowing every appliance in your home to phone out and tell the power grid when they're being used. Because I think the home is a sacred place. The body is a sacred place. Private communications are a sacred place. There's actually a Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Antoine Jones, that talks about, is the car a sacred place? And it becomes very gray, like maybe the outside of the car isn't private, but the inside of the car is private. So we need to be very strict about what private and public spaces are. And any data that leaks into the data supply chain that is private, I would argue needs regulation. And it's, and if not the data itself, definitely the uses, but I would even argue the access does, because it's a private experience. But the flip side is also true. If your data is public, can you delete your tweets? They're public, generally. If they're meant to be public, they're public. Now, if you say, hey, delete all my tweets, what if somebody copied them? Is that okay? Is someone under an obligation to delete them? I don't think so. So I think there is this. I think if the arguments moved around the axes of public and private, I think we might find some common ground. Yes, sir.
In your system, do you let the person know that their data's been accessed? Someone searches for me, pulls up my record. I don't know about it, right?
You don't.
What do you think about letting me know about it, who accessed it, and what their purposes were?
I think for certain uses that makes perfect sense, right? The FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, requires that those uses you have knowledge of who's searching you and why, and then you have some process around. You get to be in the middle of that process. I think for for other uses that are not deemed permissible purposes, there's no such regulatory framework. I think for certain uses, you're going to see some of that emerge. I would expect that sort of use-based regulations are going to kind of grow over time. I don't think there's any doubt that, in fact, at Strata in Santa Clara in February, I'm doing a discussion with Salam Barakas from NYU, who deals with a lot of these issues. He's a student of Helen Nissenbaum, who does contextual privacy. And he has been looking at inferring sensitive data from public data, right? We're all big data people. There's a lot of things you can infer. Well, certain inferences are probably inappropriate. And so what are they? And what are the consequences that might come from those? I think we need to get a little bit smarter about what's inappropriate. I think right now it's sort of the hokey pokey solution. I'm in, I'm out. But I don't think that's the human condition. I don't think it's in and out. I think it's about some of these uses are going to have a higher level of regulation. I think there's going to be finer, tighter, brighter lines around a private and public experience. And on certain use cases, you're going to be notified. But for a lot, you won't. I just want to get to people that I haven't got to, and then we'll circle back. I got all the time in the world, folks. So.
Just a follow-up on his question. So what is the current state of the regulation of this public information? For example, if I put some information on my Facebook, who is the owner of that information? Is it Facebook, or is there any regulation?
Well,
I guess you guys probably will crowd those and use those information. Does Facebook have the right to say you guys cannot use it?
oh yeah, sure. Sure. I mean, certain sites have certain terms of use that are private. I mean, one of the challenges that Facebook has faced, in my opinion, that Twitter has not faced, at least at the scale, is just that. I mean, Facebook is trying to have a somewhat private experience, but there's a lot of leakage around that private experience, and every time that information leaks, they have a PR problem, right? Twitter has had a lot less of those because everything's public. People know. They're part of that loop. They know that everything they put up there is mostly public unless direct messages and things like that. So I think there's an issue.
So basically, current state of regulation is that, for example, Facebook, they have this sole power of those information.
Yes, yes. And if they say they're going to safeguard your information, they have to safeguard it. If they say that you have a private experience, they have to give you a private experience. If they don't, they're going to come under the scrutiny of the Federal Trade Commission under Section 5, which says companies cannot engage in deceptive or unfair business practices. So if they say, basically that says they have to say what they do and do what they say. If they say they're going to protect you, they have to, or else they're going to face. And the FTC has been very tough on this. So the challenge is the technology moves around a lot. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. The blue chair, then I'll.
Yeah, okay, so, I mean, I'm a simple person, and to me, it seems like a simple thing. There's information about me, there's information about Danny. The information about Danny is valuable to me. Information about me is valuable to Danny.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is often the case that Danny knowing information about me has a negative benefit. So if we picture
Not always, but you can assume that for some time.
There are cases where that is so. But in general, it is in my best interest, and there are exceptions, to limit Intelius, just to be clear, is making money off Danny wanting my information, which is okay. And they're doing it because I'm leaking information into the public.
Or putting information. I mean,
but clearly,
putting, leaking. Right.
Well, I don't know about anyone else, but I've never entered information into the Intelius website. So when I put information out, I put it somewhere else, and Intelius got it.
Do you put information out on the web that Google gets?
That I do.
Okay.
Right?
But you don't put it into Google. Actually, you actually put it into a site that Google acquires, right?
You're
I just want to be clear.
No, you're right.
Okay.
But in this case, it is to my benefit for Google to have it. And so if Google people do
In some cases.
in any case, so to me, it seems like we are in an adversarial position, more or less, that people don't want their information out there, except there are exceptions. And Intelius and other people want information about me. So that seems to be, that's the compromise that needs to be negotiated. I mean, that seems very clear.
Yeah, and I think we're having that negotiation right now. And I think but the point of departure that is always that we always sort of we always argue about the point of departure. Your point of departure is I own my data.
I'm not saying that actually. I'm
Okay.
just saying it is in my interest.
Sure, that I agree.
Right.
I totally agree with that. There's also other parties, and it's of their interest to know about you before they get to know you better. And I want to keep it intentionally general. So I think by us being a society and being and interacting with each other, we build relationships and trust based on mutually known information about each other. And so there's a sense of, and it's a very deep feeling, that it's one of discretion and selfishness and self-preservation and very important, valid values that we all feel. And that we want to control ultimately. There's also needs on the other side that if I'm going to invite you into my world, I want to know about you. I can give you an example, but I want to take Danny's question because he's had his hand up too.
So, a high-level thought, and then I have a question.
Sure.
So I think that a society off the internet where things you require to the courthouse actually asks for a record, so there we took time, right? That's valuable. And so the regulatory framework inherently had this, especially with the police, right? It took a person to surveil me 24/7. That was really expensive. Right? This guy cost $60,000, $70,000 a year.
Right.
Right. The police don't only have so many people. We control their budget. We indirectly control the people that surveil. Putting cameras on street corners, putting all the birth records online takes away this barrier. So I think the regulatory framework has to catch up. Now I'm glad you're part of the conversation. And clearly you're one of the better people because you're here talking to us.
Mm-hmm.
But supposing you were not, Intelius was not such a benevolent corporation, you much more, we want to make as much money as possible for bankers because that's popular villainized. What are the current pressures on the company? I mean, what are the pressures externally to actually try to do it? Is it the fear of regulation? Is it the fear of people not using your system? I mean, where is the external pressure?
Oh, I think you hit on a couple of them. I think there's certain it's certainly ultimately it's the marketplace, right? Is there value for what we're doing, right? There clearly is, but is there enough, right? I mean, is Intelius one day going to be, rival some of the bigger technology companies out there? Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, so yeah, sir, we've been around 8 years. We have a good chunk of the market. Things are working okay. We are running an experiment here. Okay, I mean, no ands, ifs, or buts. We're not, untoppable. Everything is toppable, right? We may not be here next year. I might be asking you for a job, in a few years. So we are running an experiment. We're trying to run a responsible experiment. We know that it's bending some people out of shape. There's certainly market pressures that I pointed to. There's regulatory pressure, certainly. I mean, yesterday at this conference, I was sharing the panel with Laura Berger. She's a senior attorney with the FTC Enforcement Division. And we were talking about exactly these kinds of issues. Because there's benefits and economic value that accrues, but there's also some negative consequences to some of this, no doubt. So how do we got to reconcile them. And I think time will tell. If if we're not here in a few years, that's fine. I'm not going to have a hard time finding a job, right? I mean, economics and capitalism in some sense is an experiment. I think if we were not smart about this, other people would be and are. There's probably startups happening right now that are going to disrupt our business. Good. They should. I want them to. And some will fall away, some will take us down if we don't figure it out.
So capitalism works well, I agree with you, but only when property rights are assigned directly. And so what do you think about the idea, even though the fellow didn't disavow that, but what do you think about private ownership of private data, so that if I put data out on the web, I designate certain uses which are allowed to be used, and maybe aggregation, some people will not be one of those users. Anyone who works in databases knows that the database is much more than sum of its parts.
Sure.
It's aggregated, right? So it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to say, I don't want my data to be aggregated, and suppose I put this driver there, and even if you find the data, you still can't aggregate it, unless you negotiate with me and somehow convince me, give me a coupon or something, make me a payment or whatever it is that I would agree to, right? And then you can use that data, otherwise you can't. So what do you think about that?
I think for a lot of data that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I don't think I can go with you and say all data, because there's certain data that again, it comes down to if it's private data. I agree, and I think your argument is turning on if I accidentally find it, can I still use it? And that's where really. No, I know, but if you absolutely right. So there's a really interesting case that came about a year ago. Ashley Payne was a school teacher in Georgia, and she went on vacation, drank a few Guinness stouts, put those pictures on Facebook, and they found their way to the school board, and she was fired. Okay, it's Georgia. I grew up in the South, so I know there are those morals run deep. And she said it was as if someone broke into my home, stole my pictures, and used them against me. And I would argue that really isn't the whole truth. There were some wrongs that went on there, and I'll tell you what they are in a sec, but they weren't that someone broke into her home. She actually put them and shared them with somebody who was not trustworthy and shared them more broadly. And I would argue that even in today's regulatory framework, the school board was wrong for actually misusing that information. Now, I think if someone did break into your personal locker because it was a personal space and hacked in and took them, then Ashley's defense is closer to your case. But she actually took them out of the locker and shared them with someone. And so I think it's really important to sort of not just talk in generalities, but sort of dig deeper and see. In certain cases, you're absolutely right. It's a private space. It should be very carefully controlled. Versus, in fact, there's an ECPA third-party exclusion that says if you share something with a third party, you don't have any ECPA protections anymore.
And this page is my add. These standards evolve all the time.
They do, totally.
So hopefully they'll be more strict.
Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. One is, what percentage of your data is from places where it's not online, courthouses and whatnot? You have to physically go out someplace and rather than do a web search to find.
I don't know. I mean, you can assume, and I'm.
Typically, I feel like the data is already online. That's public. You can put it online or you can the public gets to it. But data that is not is. And on another side, so I was looking at your opt-out thing. You're actually requiring me to send in my driver's license or passport. So I have to give you more information to opt out of your service.
Okay.
That seems kind of ironic.
Well, if you actually look at our policy, and this, it actually says we will not use this information. We will only use this information for the opt-out and no other purpose. And the reason that I'm just not just a talking head saying that for Intelius is I control all the data in the company, and I know where it all comes from, and none of it ever comes from anything around opt-out. The reason we do require some proof of identity is so that we can opt out the right profile, the right record. Now, if you go to other data providers, they require a reason for you opting out, or they make you pay money to opt out. We don't do either of those things. We do require proof of identity. And in fact, some of the privacy activists, some of them in here in But okay, A, how will I actually pick out the right record? And if I'm representing to you, in fact, an activist said, Jim, put this on your privacy policy that you will only use this for opt-out, and we did. Go look at our privacy policy right now and you'll see that. And if we say that and we don't do that, the FTC will shut us down tomorrow. Tomorrow. I mean, the enforcement framework in the United States is vicious. Between private rights of action, attorneys general, and the Federal Trade Commission, there is tremendous enforcement in this country. As opposed to Europe, which has great aspirational privacy and very little enforcement. Very spotty enforcement, right? So I think if we did not have vicious enforcement, I think you could say, well, Jim, you can put it up there, but we all know in the United States, no one enforces anything. That's not the case. So I think you make a good point that people will think that, oh, they're just giving the monster more food, right? But I'm telling you that you're not.
So also, like, what if you just opted out of the wrong person? It wouldn't really harm them, per se?
It might. I mean, well, for example, maybe there's, we get people all the time that are a victim of mistaken identity. There's a guy that works for me. There's 38 of him in Seattle alone. Well, yes, it is, because what if someone's looking for him and someone with the same name has a criminal record? And someone mistakes this person with a criminal record for the other person, the person that doesn't. They have the same name, so he is now... No, well, not if he wants his brand space to actually be occupied with his own data, because he wants to make sure people really understand him for who he is, and he pulls that out. That vacuum will be filled by the other people that have the same name as him. So there is some benefit for him to having a footprint.
I would argue against that because
Okay.
People are mistaken anyway.
I'm just saying people do have that concern. We can agree to disagree.
I don't even think people know that they are. So, like, taking information away that they didn't know in the first place. I don't think.
Well, I would argue that it's not just our system. This data is available. We make it available and easy to search. Before sites like ours came around, yeah, you can pay somebody a couple $100, a private investigator, and they'll go do that search for you. And I know that your retort could be, yeah, that was a nice a piece of friction that kept my data more safe. But I would argue that security through obscurity and privacy through obscurity, is not much privacy at all if you're just saying, hey, a couple $100 can get the same information. I'd rather unearth this information, have this discussion, deal with some regulation if need be, and move forward responsibly and not just sort of live in the days where there was enough privacy through obscurity that it didn't matter.
But maybe it didn't need to be there. The regulations didn't need to be there because it wasn't a problem until we did it all.
That's right. And now if there is a problem, we need to deal with it. Anybody else before I go to my friend in blue?
My name is Kirill, by the way, but...
What's your name? I'm sorry.
Kirill.
Kirill.
Yeah, since everyone's citing me.
You're famous, man. Uh-oh.
Yeah, so I'll make it even simpler, the way I see it in my world. There's me, there's Danny, and there's you.
Right.
So between you and me, or the company, let's say it's a different company that's bad that doesn't have Jim Adler.
Mm-hmm.
I see there is no room for compromise unless you pay me money for my data, right? I have no benefit except for a few cases for you having this data. The only tool I have to affect that is the threat of regulation. Other than that, you could claim the data's out there, we got it, right? What are you going to do? Oh, not you, I'm sorry.
No, whatever. I won't take it personally.
In general, right? As privacy as a whole, it's a tricky thing.
But I would just argue that there is public benefit that accrues back to you, and I think we're arguing, is it the exception or is it the rule? Again, we're back to baby and bathwater. How much does it really matter? You're saying that it doesn't, all the benefit really accrues to companies like ours, and none of it accrues back to you. And I would argue that it's somewhere in the middle.
Well, the benefit accrues when each search is beginning.
Yeah.
Certainly, but there's also some benefit that accrues to him.
Yeah, I mean, there's a benefit when a landlord wants to do a background check
Right.
or a credit check or
Sure.
you want to be found.
Right. But that, right. And so there is that small thing. And
But I would argue that's just a small thing. I mean, I think you're minimizing it for the sake of your argument, which is, but I think it's somewhere there's some gray there.
Right. So I would argue companies like Intelius provide a valuable service by aggregating my data and effectively attesting to its veracity to my landlord. And now the landlord could go into the courthouse, but you're making it easy for the landlord to find out that I really am who I claim and I don't have a criminal record.
Right.
And so, and that's value to me. So setting that aside, right? Because I could say, okay, I will let you disclose the information to my landlord. Done.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, the reality is that anyone can go get my record, not people I explicitly allow. And the reason that is because there is this conflict, right? Inherently, you get a benefit, I get a unbenefit from it. The question is, how will that settle?
And so let's take it out of the issue, the very contentious issues, right? I think this comes back, there's another example, a debate that's going on that's very adjacent to this, which is the NIM wars. Should you be known online by your name or not? And I think with some knowledge of who you are comes accountability. I mean, there's this idea on that, don't feed the trolls. Comments, blog comments are often taken over by people that are anonymous. I mean, it's an audience and a mask is very empowering to act badly. So I think in society, some of the accountability mechanisms, signals we use are based on the fact that you actually have to stand behind who you are, and that is public. You have to be somewhat public, at least within a situation. So I think that, again, this idea of outside of what the current state of the people search industry is, there is an important debate that's going on around how much disclosure, how much discretion, what's appropriate, and we need to continue to have those.
But the interesting thing is where the power is, because the consumers, their only power is the threat of regulation, right? Because, and the companies are on the opposite end. The more information they have, the more information it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, but
Right.
there is something like that going on, where the companies benefit the more information they provide.
So one last point, and I think we do have to wrap it up. I did a post last January called "Your Privacy is Worth $5 a Month," right? And I backed that out of Facebook's market cap at the time, how many users they had, and how they might monetize those users, and given typical profit margins. Turns out they have to monetize $5 a month. And so they're going to have to monetize you either by getting advertising against your data, or they're going to have to charge you. And I think that some of this data that finds its way out there is in exchange for some of the services that we're all using online, mostly for free. And so I proposed a tracker charge business model for sites like this. It said, this gentleman said, I'm going to pay you $5 a month. Don't touch me, man. Just keep all my data in a locker and don't share it. Most people, I would argue, on Facebook would say, I'm willing to be personalized and targeted or whatever. And I think we're going to end up in a regime like that, so we don't have a lot of data droppings around that can be collected by companies like ours and that enter the data supply chain. That's not a bad thing. I think we need to have that discussion. The business models may have to change because right now everyone is enjoying kind of a free lunch. And that free lunch, I would argue, is not transparently is not transparent to we consumers.
And I agree with you.
Right. Wow. On that note, we should end then. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.